Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're exploring a body of source material, an in-depth essay that takes us into the biblical text to look at one of the more mysterious peoples mentioned in Scripture, the Ludites.
It's a fascinating topic and a rewarding one because the name Lud pops up in contexts that are separated by, nearly 2,000 years inside the Bible's own story?
Right, they're there at the very beginning and then again much later.
Exactly. We see them in these ancient historical records, the genealogies, and then suddenly they reappear in these sweeping prophetic visions about judgment and eventually future glory.
And the essay we're working from really treats this with a lot of care. The focus seems to be on how these really brief mentions can reveal some profound truths about God's control over history.
That's the heart of it. This isn't just about historical trivia. The essay really challenges us to see the name Lud in two very different ways. First, there's the genealogical root, which is Semitic.
From the line of Shem.
Correct. But then there's a later prophetic reference that points toward a completely different people, an Anatolian empire. Our mission today is to trace that name, understand the role they played as these, fearsome warriors, and then draw out the practical lessons for us today.
It sounds like we need to go slowly. The journey from being a son of Shem to, as you said, a global mercenary force, and then finally becoming a target for God's mission. That's a huge arc.
It's astonishing. So we'll cover the history, the geography, then the biblical narrative itself, their military roles, and then we'll get into the theological meaning, God's sovereignty, before bringing it all home with some practical application.
Okay, let's dive in. We have to start with this identity puzzle, tracing the name Lud right from the beginning.
Right. So to get the fundamental biblical identity of the Ludites, we have to start with the Table of Nations.
Genesis chapter 10.
Genesis 10. It's this foundational document after the flood, and it's really the Bible's blueprint for how humanity repopulated the earth and divided into all these different ethnic and language groups.
I think a lot of us, you're reading through Genesis and you hit the genealogies and your eyes just glaze over. But Genesis 10 is so critical for establishing God's authority over every single person.
It's the ultimate statement of our shared origin. And right there, in Genesis 10, verse 22, and it's confirmed later in 1 Chronicles 1.1 cm, it identifies Lud as a son of Shem.
And that designation, being a son of Shem, is everything.
It's critical. Shem is the ancestor of the Semitic peoples. That includes, of course, the Israelites, but also groups like the Assyrians, the Arameans, and others.
So in this original context, we're placing the Ludites geographically and culturally in the ancient Near East. Somewhere in Mesopotamia, maybe?
That's the consensus, yes. Probably flourishing somewhere along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, or maybe a bit to the west. They would have been part of that whole Semitic world.
Sharing language, culture, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Some scholars even try to connect them to historical records of peoples called the Ladi or Luda in old Assyrian documents. So the point is, their original identity is firmly Semitic. They're one piece in that huge tapestry of humanity after the flood.
Okay, that part seems straightforward enough, a necessary piece of the genealogical puzzle. But this is where the tension comes in, right? Because we jump forward hundreds and hundreds of years to the time of the prophets.
Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel.
And suddenly the context for Lud is completely different. It really seems like we're talking about a totally separate people group. What changes?
The change is, it's stark. And it's what really forces us to consider this dual identity theory. By the time of the major prophets, the name Lud is consistently grouped with distant, non-Semitic Gentile nations.
Not with their Semitic cousins anymore.
Not at all. Now they're mentioned alongside Cush, which is Ethiopia, and Put, which is Libya or North Africa, and even Tarshish, which could be as far away as Spain.
Wow, so geographically, that's a massive shift. We've left Mesopotamia entirely.
Completely. And it's not just geography. Their defining characteristic in the prophetic books is their military prowess, specifically their incredible skill with the bow and arrow.
Ah, the archers.
The archers. Isaiah 66.19 even calls them one of the distant nations who have never heard God's fame. So you take that profile, distant, powerful, non-Semitic, famous for archery, and it aligns almost perfectly with one specific historical group.
The Lydians.
The Lydians of Anatolia.
Which, for our listeners, Anatolia is modern-day Western Turkey. That's a huge distance, culturally and geographically, from the Mesopotamian Semites. It feels like a stretch to say the same name applies to both.
It feels like a stretch, but the essay makes a strong case by looking at the geopolitical reality of that time. The Lydians of Anatolia, by the 7th and 6th centuries BC, right when the prophets were writing, were a colossal power. They were a huge deal.
This is the kingdom of the famous King Croesus, right?
Yeah.
The name that's basically synonymous with being incredibly wealthy.
The very same. And that wealth is key. It's not just a legend, it's what fits them so perfectly into the prophet's warnings against proud, self-sufficient nations. Lydia was famously rich in minerals.
The Pactolus River.
The Pactolus River, yes. It carried enormous amounts of alluvial gold, what we'd call gold dust. This wasn't just a myth, it was the foundation of their entire economy and their political power.
But it was more than just having gold, wasn't it? They did something new with it.
They did. This is so important. Lydia is historically credited with being among the very first civilizations to introduce minted coinage, standardized, stamped pieces of metal.
Which would have completely revolutionized trade.
It changed everything. It made international commerce faster, more reliable, and that wealth, that innovation, it wasn't just stored away. It was used for military recruitment. It allowed them to build a powerful army.
An army famous for its cavalry and its archers.
And its elite archers. So when the prophets start talking about a distant, wealthy power known for supplying mercenary archers to the highest bidder, the historical Lydians fit that description far, far better than some obscure, ancient Semitic tribe.
So let's synthesize this. The essay is basically arguing that the prophets used an old, archaic name Lud as a kind of shorthand for the contemporary power of their day, the Anatolian Lydians.
That's the conclusion the source material points to, yes. And it's not a contradiction in the Bible. It's actually a reflection of how language and geopolitics evolve.
How so?
Well, it's a common phenomenon in history. The name of an ancient patriarch or an old tribe sticks in the collective memory, but its application gets transferred to whoever is the current big player in that region. The name Lud stuck, but the people it referred to shifted from a small Semitic tribe to this gold-rich, archer-supplying Anatolian empire.
That clarification is really helpful. It shows the Bible is engaging with real-world history, with the world as it was in the prophet's day. But the ultimate point here is theological. Whether we're talking about the original Semitic tribe or the later Anatolian empire, God sees them both. He governs them both.
Absolutely. The transition itself is an object lesson. It shows us that God uses all peoples, from the small families after the flood to the towering, wealthy Gentile empires at their peak. He uses them all in his own time and for his own unfolding plan. Both are known, both are accountable, and both are subject to his rule.
Okay, now that we've established this dual identity, this idea of them as renowned, wealthy mercenaries, let's move into the biblical narrative itself. Let's see exactly how the Ludites played their part on the world stage.
Before we jump onto the battlefields, though, it's worth pausing for just a second on the genealogies again, because it's easy to ask, why even mention them in the first place?
It's the question every modern reader has when they get to those long lists of names in Genesis or 1 Chronicles. Can I just skip this?
Right. But the essay stresses that the genealogies establish this bedrock theological truth of our shared humanity. They are a deliberate tool to show that every single nation, every people group, traces its origin back to the same created source.
So by listing Lud, no matter how small or obscure they were at the time, Scripture is making a point.
It's confirming that they are part of God's world, part of the human family, and accountable to the same creator. It doesn't matter if they achieve the fame of Egypt or Babylon, or if they remain relatively unknown. Obscurity never means absence from God's sight.
That establishes his jurisdiction, his authority over them. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the centuries where this powerful group is an active player in world events. We're focusing on their military reputation, which brings the Anatolian Lydians into the frame. Where do we see them in action?
Well, the Ludites were the definition of elite, specialized soldiers for hire. They were mercenaries, selling their very considerable military skills to the highest bidder. And this meant they got involved in the biggest conflicts of their day. The source material highlights 2 key military scenarios.
And the first involves the legendary city-state of Tyre.
Yes, the wealthy Phoenician port city. The prophet Ezekiel, in chapter 27, gives this stunning, detailed lament over Tyre. He describes its incredible wealth, its pride, its global trade network.
So it's like a list of all the nations that contributed to its splendor.
Exactly. And in Ezekiel 27, verse 10, he specifically calls out the mercenary element. He says, "Men of Persia, Lud, and Put served as soldiers in your army. They hung their shields and helmets on your walls, bringing you splendor."
That detail is so vivid. hanging their shields and helmets on your walls. It's not just that they were in the army, they were a status symbol.
Absolutely. They were a visible, elite force whose very presence was a psychological weapon. It broadcast Tyre's power and its wealth. It said, look who we can afford to hire for our security. The Ludites, with their famed archery, were an integral part of this military spectacle.
The city of Tyre basically believed it was invincible because it had purchased the best security money could buy.
And that's the profound lesson here. This ultimate expression of human strength, this security bought with gold, failed completely.
Right. The essay uses this as a direct object lesson.
It's a perfect case study. Even with the top-tier military might of elite Ludite mercenaries, Tyre could not escape the judgment God had decreed against it. The lesson is that human confidence placed in financial security and military specialization is, well, it's worthless against the sovereignty of God.
And the second context puts them on an even bigger stage. They're fighting for Egypt.
Yes, against the rising power of Babylon. This is in Jeremiah 46, verse 9. It's describing this huge clash where Egypt is mobilizing all its allies to defend itself. And the language is so vivid, so desperate.
It's a command, a call to arms.
It is. Charge, you horses. Drive furiously, you charioteers. March on, you warriors, men of Cush and Put who carry shields. Men of Lydia led who draw the bow.
So again, we see this international coalition. Egypt is pulling in military assets from the ends of the known world. Cush from the south, Put from North Africa,
and Lud from all the way up in Anatolia. It shows the reach of Egypt's influence, but also their desperation. They were seriously threatened by Babylon, and so they leveraged all their wealth to build this massive, fearsome coalition army.
And again, the text specifically calls out Led's specialty, who draw the bow.
It highlights exactly why they were so valuable, why Egypt would pay them to travel so far to fight. They were the premier long-range archers of their day, the special forces, if you will.
But this grand coalition, even with all its specialized international talent, according to the prophecy, it was doomed.
It was. Jeremiah's oracle declares that this entire multinational force, the best archers, the best charioteers, the best shield bearers from across the world, would be utterly crushed by Babylon, which was God's chosen instrument of judgment at that time.
It's the same theme, just on a bigger scale.
It's the recurring theme. The Ludites, as obscure as they are to us now, serve in Scripture as this benchmark for maximal human military capability. They represent the peak of what money can buy and what skill can achieve in warfare. And yet, time and again, they're shown to be completely powerless against God's sovereign decree.
It's just remarkable how this one minor people group is used to illustrate such a major theological point. But then the narrative takes a completely different turn in the last reference. We move away from the battlefield entirely.
We do. We move into the future of global proclamation. This is in Isaiah 66, verse 19, and it provides this beautiful, stunning contrast to their role as mercenaries.
What does it say?
Here, God is speaking of the end times, of a future restoration. And he says he will set a sign and send his messengers to the distant nations, including Lud, Tarshish, Pul, and others who have, quote, neither heard my fame nor seen my glory.
That's a staggering change in purpose.
Yeah.
The people known for drawing the bow in service of Tyre or Egypt are now designated as a target for God's own revelation.
It connects directly to this bigger universal vision that runs through the prophets. God's plan was never just for Israel. It always included a future proclamation of his name to the Gentiles, to all the nations.
So in this one verse, Lud transitions from being a tool of temporary human power
to being a vital recipient of God's ultimate global mission.
And it seems to go even further. The passage says they won't just receive the message.
No, it says, they will proclaim my glory among the nations. This means the Ludites, or the peoples they represent, aren't just missionary targets, they become future messengers themselves.
Wow.
The essay links this, of course, to the Great Commission in the New Testament, and ultimately to the vision of the millennial kingdom when all nations will come to worship the Lord. The message of Isaiah 66 is that God's plan of salvation includes even the most geographically distant and culturally obscure peoples.
So if you trace that whole arc, it's incredible. They start as a name in a genealogy, confirming shared humanity. Then they become a symbol of elite, but ultimately fragile worldly power. And they end up as these future recipients and even proclaimers of God's eternal glory.
It's a comprehensive journey, and it just shows the incredible density and intentionality packed into even the smallest details of the Old Testament. Nothing is wasted, nothing is random.
This movement from being just a name in a list to being a key player in these prophetic dramas, It forces us to get into the deep theological significance here, and the essay frames this through the lens of God's complete sovereignty over all of history.
That's the key. The perspective here is that God is actively governing the rise and the fall of every single nation. The Gentile powers, even one as specialized as Lud, have a necessary role in his redemptive plan, whether they realize it or not.
It's so easy for us as modern believers to get focused on our personal spiritual lives and, forget that God is simultaneously managing this grand chessboard of international politics and power.
That is the big picture insight the Ludite story offers us. And the references carry this powerful dual message. On one hand, the genealogies in Genesis assure us that all nations are known by him, created by him. That establishes his ownership.
And on the other hand,
On the other hand, the prophecies reveal that these same nations, even when they are at the peak of their strength, their wealth, their pride, their military skill, are completely subject to his judgment if they act in opposition to his purposes.
the Anatolian Ludites, the Lydians, were really the poster child for human confidence. They had the best archers, the most gold. So how does their story serve as this warning against putting our trust in those things?
They are the ultimate case study in the transience of human strength. The Lydian kingdom, ruled by the proverbially rich Croesus, was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia in 547 BC. I mean, just think about that for a moment.
Okay.
A kingdom famous across the world for its inexhaustible gold supply and its elite specialized army was just swept away.
So the very things that defined them, financial security and military invincibility, were proven to be totally meaningless in a single historical moment.
Absolutely. The contexts where Lud appears are always at the height of human ambition. They're providing security for Tyre, the world's richest trading hub. They're fighting on the front lines of the biggest war of the era between Egypt and Babylon, and in every single case, that strength is not only proven to be temporary, it's explicitly condemned by God's prophets beforehand.
It's almost as if God intentionally chooses the strongest examples of human power to make his point most clearly.
He does. The source material highlights this stark pattern. Tyre, relying on its wealth and Ludite mercenaries, fell. Egypt, relying on its alliances and Ludite archers, was defeated. And Lydia itself, relying on its own gold and military, was conquered.
Military might and economic ambition.
Those are the two areas where human beings most proudly declare their independence from God, their self-sufficiency. But they are the exact arenas where God most clearly demonstrates his overruling sovereignty. He proves that the strongest shield, the fastest chariot, and the deepest gold reserve are utterly useless when they stand against a divine decree.
Which brings us back then to that hopeful vision in Isaiah 66. If their present role was to show the failure of human strength, how does their future role offer a different theological picture?
It offers the ultimate picture of hope and redemption. The vision of Lud receiving God's messengers and seeing his glory points forward to a time of global restoration, a time of transformation.
And the implication is that the very things they represented, their military skill, their economic resources, will be redeemed and repurposed for good.
Exactly. The theological point is so powerful. All that worldly power and economic resource that the Ludites and Lydians epitomized, all of it will one day be turned to the service of the Lord. Instead of drawing the bow for gold, they will use their lives to proclaim his glory. The prophecy transforms them from symbols of human pride into instruments of God's global mission.
So the Ludites become this prophetic picture, confirming that God's plan includes everyone. All nations, Semitic or Gentile, obscure or wealthy, will one day acknowledge him.
It's the ultimate statement on the scope of God's grace and the absolute certainty of his kingdom agenda. He doesn't miss anyone, and he doesn't forget anyone.
Okay, this has been an incredible deep dive into the history and theology. Now we have to bring this home. How do we apply these lessons practically to our lives as believers today? What's the first, most enduring lesson from the Ludite story?
The first, and I think the most foundational lesson, is about the absolute extent of God's sovereignty. We live in a world where it's so easy to feel overwhelmed by the geopolitical news cycle, by global economics, by the rise and fall of political powers.
We feel like things are out of control.
We do. And the Ludites remind us that God's rule is comprehensive. It's not just limited to our private spiritual life or the internal business of the church. It extends over every global force, every market, every army.
It's that truth from the book of Daniel, isn't it? He removes kings and sets up kings.
That's it, exactly. Daniel 2.21. The flow of international trade, the shifting tides of financial power, the deployment of armies, all of it is under his ultimate control.
So the practical takeaway for us, living in our own time of complex economics and military power, is a clear warning about where we place our security.
It's a profound check on our hearts. The Ludite strengths, the gold and the bow, military might and economic prosperity, are shown to be temporary and deeply uncertain. They are never a reliable shield. For the modern believer, that means our ultimate security cannot be in the stock market or in our nation's military or even in our personal 401k.
Because those systems are, in the end, just as fragile as Tyre's walls were.
Precisely. Worldly systems are destined to be shaken. So what about the fact that the Ludites themselves were not a huge empire? They weren't Babylon or Rome, they were specialists. Why does God single them out in these huge prophetic moments? And that leads right into the second application. God uses the obscure and the specialized. The Ludites weren't a dominant geopolitical power, they were essentially highly skilled contractors. Yet they show up in these key prophetic moments where God is making a statement about his total authority over all nations, big and small.
So God's plan isn't just concerned with the major players on the world stage. It's granular, it's detailed. He notices everyone.
Yes. And for you, for the listener, this is such an encouraging reminder. No person, no community, no area of expertise is too small or too remote to be part of God's plan. If you feel obscure, if your career feels highly niche, if your church feels small. The Ludite story reminds us that obscurity is completely irrelevant to God. He weaves the specialized and the seemingly minor into his vast eternal plan.
Let's focus on that mercenary aspect for a minute, because I think that speaks to us. The Ludites sold their specialized skill, their archery, to serve human kings and temporary empires. What's the warning in that for us?
That's a crucial point. The Ludites' fatal flaw was that their incredible skill was put entirely at the service of worldly transient powers. For us, the application is a warning. We must be careful that our professional specialization, our intellectual gifts, our modern version of the Lydian bow doesn't become our ultimate confidence or our master.
Meaning, if I'm a software engineer and my bow is my coding skill,
Mm-hmm.
if I become so focused on mastering that skill just to generate wealth or serve a corporate tire that I ignore God's purposes, I'm walking that same mercenary path.
You've put it perfectly. We have to guard against placing our ultimate trust in our human skill, our technology, our financial savvy. When we align our specialized abilities purely with the systems of this world systems that are, at their root, opposed to God's rule, we are mirroring that Ludite mercenary who aimed his bow for gold and not for God's glory.
And building on that positive turn we saw in Isaiah 66, moving from mercenary to missionary target, what does that final vision teach us about God's heart?
It brings into sharp focus the missionary heart of God. The Old Testament vision of God sending messengers to Lud, to these distant nations who had never even heard his name, shows his comprehensive global desire to make himself known to all peoples.
This is the ancient root of the Great Commission.
It is the Old Testament certainty that grounds the New Testament mandate. That mission is carried forward today through the church in Matthew 28, the call to go and make disciples of all nations. The Ludite example reinforces the certainty of the final outcome. God's fame will be proclaimed to the ends of the earth.
So we've got these lessons. Don't trust in the world systems. Our obscurity doesn't matter to God, and we must dedicate our specialized skills to him. What's the final practical challenge, then, that we can take away from this?
The final challenge is a really personal, penetrating question for all of us. Where do you place your ultimate dependence? The Ludite story urges us to place absolutely no confidence in human strength or in our accumulated wealth.
When we look at our bank accounts, our political stability, our perceived security.
We have to remember that all of it is temporary and uncertain. Crusus's famous golden river, the Pactolus, eventually ran dry. The archer's bow eventually broke.
And so true security is found elsewhere.
It is. True, lasting, unshakable security is found only in our confidence in God's word and in aligning ourselves with his eternal purposes. If our trust is in temporary human solutions, we are aligning ourselves with the very powers that God has promised to bring low. But if we trust in him, we align ourselves with the King who rules an eternal kingdom.
What an incredible journey. This deep dive into the Ludites has been so much richer than I expected. We started with what seems like an obscure name in a genealogy.
And we discovered that this one people group serves as this powerful biblical witness. Their story spans from Genesis, confirming our shared origin, all the way to the prophets, where they show us the fragility of worldly power.
And the certainty of future global worship. Their story is such a clear testimony. God knows all the nations. He governs their rise and fall, and he uses every single one of them for his purposes.
Whether they are Semitic founders or wealthy Anatolian mercenaries, they are all part of his plan for the global revelation of his glory.
And the most encouraging part, that ultimate point of redemption, is really captured in that final passage we looked at from Isaiah 66.
Let's revisit that one more time as we close. Isaiah 66, verse 19. I will set a sign among them, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that have neither heard my fame nor seen my glory. They will proclaim my glory among the nations.
The transformation is just breathtaking. The very people once known for selling their skill with the bow to serve temporary human kings for gold, they will be the ones proclaiming God's eternal glory across the earth.
That's the encouragement we take away. God's ultimate purpose isn't just judgment. It is the comprehensive global proclamation of his fame to all the earth. The Ludites, representing all those distant, unheard-of nations, will be brought into his presence and will participate in his mission.
A beautiful thought to end on.
So may you, the listener, walk today in that confidence, remembering that the Most High God rules every kingdom, governs every economy, and uses even the most obscure peoples and details of history for the full and certain revelation of his glory, leading all things toward that final day when every knee will bow and every tongue confess his name.